Delegate Ruth, and Delegate Ruth will be talking about the second of two PFAS bills that kind of follow the deep dive that Brent gave us and that Senator Love let us into. But real quick, Delegate Ruth has represented District 44B in Western Baltimore County since 2020. She serves on the Labor Elections and Government Committee and sits on its Labor Subcommittee. Her priorities include climate action, transit equity, and racial justice, and she has also fought for laws that would allow the Attorney General to prosecute big oil companies for knowingly contribute to climate change. So, Delegate Ruth, you always bring meaningful legislation forward, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you and your passion on on these pieces of legislation. So I'm going to kick it over to you to start with this one.
Great. Thank you so much. And can you hear me? Okay, great. And I want to start by giving a shout out to Senator Love for really leading this effort. And as she mentioned, we had and has been mentioned several times. We had a number of work groups that met throughout the year, and I was really honored to be able to take part in that. So I'm going to turn it over to Betsy Nicholas first, and she's going to talk a little bit about the problem.
Thank you, Delegate Ruth. And like Senator Love, Delegate Ruth has been working on this very thorny issue of PFAS, toxic forever chemical contamination. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to keep this quick because we talked about PFAS a lot already. In terms of previous legislation on pretreatment, that's really focusing on things like landfill leachate and industrial discharges into wastewater treatment plants. The other big category, kind of what's putting contamination there beyond those industrial discharges, is consumer products. So we heard in those work groups very extensively from wastewater treatment plants that this would be a big help to them, and is also consistent with work that we've already been doing in Maryland for some time. And some companies are taking the lead and actually starting to phase out use, like REI and Patagonia are phasing out the use of some of the PFAS chemicals in their products. So as we talked about it, waterproofing, stain resistance, all of these things are where we're getting them from. And they are highly toxic, so highly toxic in very small amounts that, in fact, the level that was set as sort of a safe level by EPA is below the level at which we can even measure them with modern sampling techniques. So, Delegate Ruth and many colleagues took a big look at what's happening in other places in the country where we can realistically say that we need to phase these out of the consumer products without it functionally changing the product in a negative way. And we're hoping that the wastewater treatment plants who said they really wanted this and would support it will step up and do so. And I'm just going to hand it back to Delegate Ruth, and she can talk a little bit more about the bill itself.
Great. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you so much, Betsy. Just to really quick, I want to talk a little bit about definitions before I talk about the products, because the definitions are really important. And in this bill, we define PFAS as any product that has one fully fluorinated carbon atom. And what that means is a carbon atom which is surrounded by fluorine atoms, or where all the connections are fluorine atoms, and that carbon, is it fluorine or fluoride? I'm sorry. That carbon fluoride bond is, as has been said, the strongest bond. And so, we're not all of the chemicals that have that bond have been studied extensively, but right now we need to regulate those as a class because there's enough evidence that they all have some health harms that we want to err on the side of caution and make sure that we're phasing them all out. And maybe we'll see what happens in the future, but as these continue to get studied. But the other thing couple of things I wanted to mention is intentionally added, that this bill talks about intentionally added PFAS. where we know these PFAS are added for a specific purpose to make it stain resistant, water resistant, grease resistant. And then there are some the Department of Environment is can by regulation designate some products as currently unavoidable use. So that's another thing that's been used in other states. We looked a lot at some of the other states that have worked on PFAS. Maine and Minnesota, I think, were the first two to do extensive product bans. We've also looked at some others. Colorado, California has done some. Of course, their most recent bill was vetoed. And we also looked at New Mexico, and we leaned rather heavily on New Mexico because theirs is the most recent and they learned a lot from some of the other states. But we did also look at what some other states have done as well. One of the things that so we have two categories. January 1st, 2028, these are the products that we're phasing out. We require manufacturers to stop selling products that contain intentionally added PFAS in these categories as of January 1st, 2028. Cleaning products, cookware, cosmetics, personal care products, which is like shampoos and lotions, dental floss, feminine hygiene products, pet food packaging, juvenile products, and intimacy products, which is things like condoms and lubricants. January 1st, 2029, fabric treatments, ski wax, textiles, clothing, things like that, textile furnishings, upholstered furniture, and paint. One thing that we did not do that some of the other states have done is some of the other states had like a 2032 date, which was everything else. The problem we found is that some of the everything else gets really complicated and you have to dig into some really complicated exceptions and a lot of debate. So we right now just erred on the side of this quite extensive list, and as we go along in the future, we can always come back and look at adding more or adding in everything else. The other thing the bill does is it requires by January 1st, 2028, it requires manufacturers to disclose and register with MDE any products which do contain intentionally added PFAS, including those that are designated as currently unavoidable uses. They still have to disclose. And there were some questions in the Q&A about does I think insulation was one. Does this contain PFAS? Well, that's why it's very important that we have manufacturers disclose that. And there are abilities of MDE to require testing of products that they think may contain PFAS that were not disclosed, with some penalties for noncompliance. And there is also the creation of a special fund, which ties in also with the biosolids bill. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap up. And happy to answer any questions in the Q&A and go to the next bill, which is the climate crimes, and I'm going to turn it over to Brittany Baker to start with.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Delegate Ruth. Glad to be here today. I was on yesterday as well, and many of you know us at Chesapeake Climate Action Network. We're really excited to, again, I mean, we've supported this bill from the beginning, but this year we're really, really being robust about our support because we want to see this get over the finish line. And a big reason that this bill is so important to us is because comprehensive peer-reviewed studies confirm that fossil fuel companies have known since the 1970s about climate change, and they have deliberately misled the public about what they knew about climate change and what they knew about the risk of fossil fuel emissions. And there's evidence present in their internal deliberations, in the scientific research that they sponsored, and then how that contrasts with public rhetoric. And I'll put a news article in the chat that talks about this a little bit more. And so we're really excited to get this over the finish line this year because it's very different from some of the other methods of revenue generation around adaptation. We know that CCAN has been working diligently on the Renew Act, but that's separate. And then we also know that this year there's highly likely going to be a cap and invest bill, but that's totally separate as well. Because when we talk about climate crimes, we're more leaning into that idea of deception, disinformation, misinformation. And so this bill will set up the legal landscape to ensure that at the right time, the right litigation can move forward and hold the largest, most polluting fossil fuel companies accountable for how they've misled the public. So back to you, Delegate Ruth.
Thank you so much. And as Brittany said, this is about companies that lied and misled the public, deceived the public, and committed fraud, and using propaganda, which prevented action in a timely way. If lawmakers and the public had not been deceived by this misinformation, we might have taken action sooner and been able to prevent some of the damage that we're already seeing now. So this bill will authorize the Attorney General to hold the very large fossil fuel companies accountable for their illegal actions. So it's not holding them accountable for climate change, it's holding them accountable for the illegal actions that prevented timely response to climate change. And it doesn't require any lawsuits. All it does is it sets the stage for the Attorney General to make decisions about those lawsuits and to move forward with anything that he deems is a viable lawsuit. It also creates a climate crimes accountability fund for managing any funds that come in from any settlements or judgments, and then those funds can be used for administrative costs of further lawsuits. They can also be used for mitigating the damage caused by climate change from these illegal actions. It also does exempts these suits from something called the Uniform Contribution Among Tortfeasors Act, or just UCATA for short. This is something the Attorney General said that he needs in order to file these suits. The UCATA, and I'm not a lawyer, but it basically has to do with how the liability is allocated between people, between defendants when there are multiple defendants, and allows defendants to sue each other. The Attorney General said that this is a barrier to him being able to settle with any of these companies. And so this bill exempts these suits from the UCATA law in the same way that we exempted the Key Bridge suits from the UCATA law 2 years ago. That's basically it, and I feel very hopeful that this is going to move forward this year. This is really important so that the taxpayers are not holding the bag, paying the costs for damages caused by these illegal actions. Okay, so the next bill is the Data Center Planning and Transparency Act. I think you heard yesterday about some other data center bills. There's obviously a lot of concerns about data centers, the energy and the environment, and a lot of other things. I'm looking at it from a Planning and Transparency Act. I'm going to turn it over to Dave to set the stage.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Ruth. Uh, as you know, and as you talked about yesterday, we talked considerably amount of time on data centers. We are really currently at a rush to approve and build data centers, really through a chaotic and poorly planned process. Counties, municipalities really virtually have no experience planning or even understanding all the implications of approving data centers, especially the new hyperscale data centers, which can use as much electricity and as much water as the city of Baltimore, and may have several hundred diesel generators at one site. We are currently seeing large-scale data center events or activities happening in Frederick, Baltimore, Montgomery, Prince George's, and Howard counties. And we know it's going to be happening all over, just as we see it happening all over in Virginia. So they're not just happening in Data Center Alley, they're happening all over in Virginia. And this is going to happen to Maryland, there really are no geographic boundaries of where data centers can really occur. Guidance on rigor around planning is key to really these local decisions. Also, at a state level, no one agency really tracks and publishes information about the locations, energy usage, source of power, greenhouse gas emissions, and number of diesel backup generators. This real bill really takes a gigantic step forward in really addressing these issues. Back to you, Delegate Ruth.
Thank you so much, Dave. And I just want to mention, as this says on the slide, data centers have been around for decades, but what we're seeing now is an explosion in the number and size, as Dave has pointed out. I worked in a building with a data center back in the 1980s, but we're not talking about run-of-the-mill data centers now. We're talking about massive data centers. And by way of comparison, one data center that's being planned in my district would require 150 megawatts of energy. And I noticed that the two gas plants that are being proposed to the PSC, one of them will generate 150 megawatts of energy. So we're talking about an entire gas plant that will generate just enough energy for one data center. And so this is a huge problem. I'm looking at it, though, from a planning perspective. And in Maryland, land use and planning is the purview of the counties. So this bill does not try to be too prescriptive in what counties have to do, but it basically says counties have to have a plan. They have to figure out things like siting, where data centers should be allowed to go, where they shouldn't be allowed to go, including perhaps underserved and overburdened communities, agricultural land, undeveloped land, forests. Those are all things that need to be looked at. What type of zoning changes might need to be made? And again, not being prescriptive about what those are, but the counties have to take a look at that. Permitting, community engagement, what community benefits the county might want to require, labor standards for these data centers, and more. So it requires the county or municipality to develop a plan and to publish that plan and to submit that plan to the Maryland Department of Planning. And it does exempt counties which have already developed a plan, because I know some have or are working on it. And then it also says that before any data center moves forward with anything, that they have to submit a disclosure report in advance. And there's a whole, they have to submit to the Department of Planning, but there's other agencies, local and state agencies, they have to submit to, and there's a whole list of things that they have to disclose. And it also says that no state funds, that's grants, that's loans, that's tax incentives, can go to any data center until, first of all, the county or municipality has a plan in place and the data center development has filed a disclosure. So the details of this are still being worked out. I have this out for comment and have gotten a lot of comments back. I have a meeting scheduled with the Department of Planning, but this is the basic form that it's going to take. So that's it, and move on to the next slide, please. So this one I'm going to be pretty quick with. This one, I'm still working out the shape of it. Next slide, please. And so the main problem is residential pesticide application can drift onto neighbors' property, potentially impacting human, pet, pollinator, and environmental health. If somebody wants to treat their own property with pesticides, we don't really stop them from doing that. They have a right to do that. But if my neighbor treats their yard, I should be able to protect my own property from any drift or from trespass. And I actually have had constituents reach out to me about bad actors who have actually trespassed onto their property and treated areas on their property physically. So we need to make sure that people are protected when their neighbors' yards are treated by commercial applicators. So some of the things that this bill will do is require an expanded notification. Right now, if you are chemically sensitive, you can get a doctor's note and get onto a list to be notified. We're looking to really expand who gets notified when their neighbor is treating for pesticides. Also, making sure that we protect residential pollinator gardens. My entire front yard is a native pollinator garden, and so this is something I worry about a lot. I had a lot of monarch caterpillar deaths this year, and I don't know if it was from pesticide, but I can't help wondering if there was a neighbor who used pesticides that caused that. And then the last thing, and then I'll wrap up because I think I've run over time, is better regulating subscription services. So commercial applicators have subscription services where you can sign up. They come out quarterly and treat. Some of them will only treat by subscription services. They won't come out unless you sign up for the subscription services. And this is a huge problem because you don't even have to be home when they come out. So after the first treatment, they just come out quarterly. They put the pesticides down. They tell you they came out. They send you a bill. They don't even have to touch base with you or talk with you. I think this is a real avenue for overuse of pesticides, unnecessary use. So we're looking at really limiting and regulating that, not stopping the subscription services, but to make sure that they're regulated. And that's it. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat.